Hello and welcome to Global Bridges, a podcast dedicated to exploring global political developments, international security, and the evolving relationship between major international actors in a rapidly changing world, as we can see. This podcast is produced by the Social Research Center of Azerbaijan, a public research institution that conducts analytical and empirical research across a wide range of social, political, and economic issues. While the center's work is not limited exclusively to international relations, it actively engaged with global affairs, security developments, and foreign policy debates as part of its broader analytical mission. Our discussions are aimed at contributing to informed public debate and political oriented analysis. And today's conversation will also be adapted into an analytical article and to be published on the Social Research Center's website and shared with media outlets in Baku. I am Pasha Bayramov, leading advisor at the Social Research Center of Azerbaijan, and I am very pleased to welcome today's guest, Professor Jamie Gaskarth of Chatham House. Professor Jamie Gaskarth is a prominent British scholar specializing in foreign policy and international relations. He's a professor of foreign policy and international relations and has published extensively on British and European foreign policy, transatlantic relations, and the role of ideas, as I have researched on Google. So, if you would like, we could start directly with my questions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, the first one will be about US-Europe relations. As of now, as we can see, that there are some tricky situations between US and Europe at the point, but how would you assess the current state of US-Europe relations today compared to 5 or 10 years ago? Do you see more continuity or more fundamental change in the transatlantic relationships for the future?
Thanks. I think that's a really good question, and the kind of historical input into this is quite important because the US and Europe have been drifting apart a little bit over the recent decades. The US has been thinking about doing a pivot to Asia and focusing on the threat from China and managing the Pacific region and gradually, slowly withdrawing from Europe. So that's a kind of ongoing process. But the current Trump administration and its actions in recent months are unprecedented in how antagonistic relations have got between the US and Europe. I mean, this is the biggest crisis since Suez in 1956, where you have a president who seems to be implying that if he doesn't get his way, then he might engage in military action against a NATO partner in order to effectively steal parts of their territory for US security reasons. I mean, that flies in the face of the NATO North Atlantic Treaty, that idea of collective defense. It causes all sorts of confusion over Article 5 because when a NATO member is attacked, Article 5 of the treaty stipulates that you're supposed to see that as an attack on everybody within the NATO organization. Well, if one NATO member is attacking another NATO member, it all gets very confusing about how you should respond to that. And so it's created all sorts of real fractures within NATO. Some very senior former NATO commanders, like General Sir Richard Sheriff, has described the US as a greater threat to NATO than Vladimir Putin. And so, very, very serious kind of fractures going on.
The second one would be Europe's strategic role and its autonomy. The idea of European strategic autonomy is often discussed recently in policy debates, as we can see. And how realistic is this concept in practice, do you think? Can Europe strengthen its defense and security capacity without weakening the transatlantic partnership? Is it possible, as Macron also mentioned?
Yeah, it's possible in theory because the Trump administration has been calling for the European powers to be spending more on their own defense for some time. And their defense budgets are rising in response to that. So in some ways, the US administration would probably like Europe to adopt more of the burden of European security and defense, spend more, and allow the US to withdraw certainly their kind of physical footprint in Europe in order to concentrate on the Pacific. The only thing is, well, there's a few different aspects to that. One of them is that actually a US presence in Europe gave the US a lot of influence and control over how Europe thought about its defense and security, what kind of partnerships it made around the world. So if the US is withdrawing from that kind of role, it does mean that Europe would be able to forge its own independent path, and that might be one that the US administration would suddenly be rather uneasy about. If you think about the number of countries that are currently either planning or have just returned from or in the process of visiting China, if, for instance, Europe forged its own independent policy towards China, became much more friendly towards it, circumvented US pressure on China by providing an alternative market, that kind of thing would get a lot of pushback from the Trump administration. So in principle, you'd think the Trump administration would welcome EU or European strategic autonomy, but it might not actually like the consequences of having another kind of bloc that is independent or more independent than the US and maybe goes its own way and undermines US policy in other areas. There are also kind of issues around the practicality of strategic autonomy, because the European Union is fundamentally a civilian forum for member states to get together and forge a kind of regime of law and institutions and multilateral solutions to problems. But many of its members are uneasy about the military kind of posture for the EU. They don't want to kind of merge into that. Some of them, like Ireland, have a long history of not wanting to align with any particular bloc and wanting to have an independent defence policy, and they wouldn't necessarily want the EU to become more militaristic. You've got other countries like Hungary that perhaps don't see the Russia threat in the same way that other Western European countries do, and so they might not support that kind of uplift in European defence spending. So there are all sorts of issues and problems of the politics of within the EU and Europe generally about how you do that. And you can also see the UK's role in that is complicated, because since we've left the European Union, you now have the UK outside, but still one of the most military capable states within the region, and therefore it's very difficult to talk about European security without including the UK.
I was going to ask you about, I was going to ask you about the UK's position on that, so it was actually good that you came up with that. So you can continue on that, because I want to hear the UK's position also, as you're from there.
Yeah, well, there's some haggling at the moment over, for instance, SAFE, the large defence procurement fund that the EU has put together. It can leverage a lot more borrowing than individual member states or individual states in the region. And so they've put together this big kind of fund to increase spending on defence. But at the moment, the UK is only kind of at the margins of that. Some sort of 35% or so of defence contracts can be allocated to UK companies, but we're not a member of that SAFE programme. And that means we're not fully integrated into it. And French arms manufacturers allegedly have been arguing against UK inclusion because they worry about the UK getting a larger slice of those contracts. And so there is that kind of states and particular defence sectors within the EU member states kind of grappling for their own self-interest rather than thinking of the larger, bigger picture about how do we actually very quickly upscale our defence spending and our capabilities in light of the less reliable US umbrella that they've lived under for many years.
Thank you so much. And also, as we can see, the things are going on about the Greenland issue. I don't know if it will be like a conspiracy theory to even discuss it, but do you think, like, is it possible for US to actually intervene with the military power to get Greenland? I cannot imagine that situation, but what do you think about it? Is it possible?
It's it's very difficult to talk about what's possible and impossible when you're dealing with President Trump. You would generally say that it was extremely unlikely, I think. And I think Trump has backed down from his position. He was probably sort of flying a kite by intimating that if he doesn't get what he wants, then he will do that. But in the latest speech, he did actually emphasize that he wouldn't use military force. And so it would be a bit strange, I think, if he went back from that now. But it's interesting. There's a lot of research on leaders as they get older. Apparently, are less risk averse. They will take riskier actions as leaders get older. And that is the world we're living in at the moment. It's interesting that we have, the three kind of major powers engaging in or threatening military action. You have the US, President Trump, very elderly, Vladimir Putin in his 70s now, Xi Jinping in his 70s as well. And so, if that is a factor in the future, that kind of is slightly concerning. That the idea that as leaders get older, they take more risks.
Looking ahead, like 2026 and beyond, toward 2026 and the years beyond, what key political strategic factors do you think will shape US-Europe relations? It might be, I don't know, maybe Greenland also would be part of it. But overall, are you optimistic or cautious about the future of the transatlantic partnership going in the future?
Optimism, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I think it's for a long time, security policymakers have been saying the world is more dangerous and more uncertain. And for a long period, that was not really quite true. But at this time, I think it is true because there are a lot of uncertainties about how certain kind of big structural factors are going to play out. So the influence of climate change is going to be very important in the coming decades. And probably needs more attention, really, from policymakers about what that means. So, on a very basic level, if you're sat in the UK and you're looking north, with the polar ice caps melting and the opening up of those regions to trade and to navigation, you're going to see a lot more. It's going to be a lot easier for China and Indo-Pacific powers to use the Arctic as a route to trade with Europe and with North America. But then also you have those security concerns as well, that you will have Chinese boats perhaps patrolling in what's called the high north in the North Atlantic in the future, that Russia will be asserting itself more aggressively. And so that space, which has been perhaps a little bit more benign, particularly since the end of the Cold War, suddenly could get opened up and become much more contested. I think the reaction to the US when it comes to Chinese policy in the region is going to be very important, and that's uncertain. If China did choose to invade Taiwan in 2027 next year, which allegedly was a goal that the leadership set for their military to be able to do that by then. If they did choose to do that, how would Trump react? Would he, aggressively respond and we end up with a major war between great powers, or would he just accept it as spheres of influence and see that as a reflection of what he was doing in Venezuela or Russia was doing in Ukraine? And so the reaction to that would be very important. You could have a catastrophic trade war or even a shooting war between two superpowers, or you could have a kind of damp squib of a muted response. Taiwan loses its independence and things go back to normal, essentially. So we don't know about that, really. The influence of climate change on whole areas of the world becoming, uninhabitable, much greater migration, uncertain weather patterns affecting crops and affecting supply chains and all those sorts of things. Those kind of factors worry me a little bit and make me less optimistic, I guess, about the future, unfortunately.
Exactly, me too. Also, from Davos meetings, we saw the video of Macron's speech, and he said he would like to invite Chinese to invest in Europe in different fields. Do you think it was a direct message to US that we possibly
Yes.
invite China?
Yes, I don't. I think it was probably a rather unsubtle one. It kind of reflects some of the diplomacy that Mark Carney's been engaging in, the Canadian Prime Minister, where, just to remind the US that actually other markets are available, and if they're going to be unreliable, if they're going to be coercive and aggressive in their bargaining, then countries have the option to go elsewhere, and they will do so. So yes, I think that is a part of it. I think Macron's kind of hinting at that. It's difficult there's a few reasons why it is difficult to engage more fully in China, with China, on the part of European countries, because they define themselves as liberal democracies and have liberal values.
Exactly.
They are uneasy about some of Chinese policies on the treatment of their own population, on human rights restrictions, on information, freedom of information, and expression, those sorts of things. They create frictions. But I think essentially, I think a lot of European countries would like a warmer relationship with China, and that seems to be slightly kind of inhibited by a sort of self-defeating policies of the Chinese government. There's been a lot of Chinese hacking of UK and European companies trying to access their technology. It's not necessarily directly tied to the Chinese government. They're often private actors, but the assumption is that they're acting on behalf of official channels. And that creates uncertainty. We've had a lot of allegations in the UK about the Chinese hacking of the Electoral Commission, of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and various other kind of organs of government. And so it's kind of that creates a boundary and limits the amount of warmth that the Chinese state can have with European and UK governments, because it creates that tension. I don't know always what's driving it, or why they're engaging in the kind of level of espionage they are, because I think a lot of European countries want to focus on Russia as the key threat and would rather China was neutral, or even kind of have a closer relationship with China to offset the US and to try and exert some leverage over the relationship with Russia.
Okay. So final question would be the concluding question. If policymakers on both sides of Atlantic, Europe and US, could take one concrete step to strengthen the transatlantic cooperation in the coming years, what do you think it should be, that step? Because it doesn't look at this moment good, as we can say, because of the Trump administration's recent activities.
I think European states, if they want to take a concrete step, is to engage in rapid acquisition of real defense capabilities. I think there's been a lot of the way European states have kind of managed their defense over the last few decades is to talk big and then have very limited capabilities that are almost wholly reliant in the background with on their relationship with the US. So they don't have a proper strategic lift, or all the enablers, the command and control, the long-range precision fires, the ability to suppress enemy air defenses, those sorts of basic capabilities. Europe doesn't have that capability, and as long as it doesn't, it can't be seen as an independent actor, and it's wholly reliant on US benevolence. So, if you want a more constructive relationship, transatlantic relationship, that's got to be a priority. Get real capabilities, and be very wary of promises of jam tomorrow, of a fantastic fighting force in 10 years' time. But in the meantime, we're going to continue to have hollowed out forces that are not actually militarily capable, either independently or without the US in particular. I think that would be a key thing. In terms of the US, what could they concretely do to enhance the transatlantic relationship? I think tone down the rhetoric, and maybe not threaten to invade your closest allies. I think would be quite concrete steps to reassurance.
I understood you perfectly. So, Professor Gaskarth, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us today. And your analysis has been extremely valuable. I think it will be valuable, and also as an article wise. Also, your analysis was valuable for us for understanding both the current challenges and the future prospects of US-Europe relations. It has been a pleasure from my side to host you, and I will provide you with the article links soon. And also thanks to our audience for watching us. Thank you a lot, Mr. Gaskarth.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye.
See you.